My name is Abhi, and today we are going to be talking about an eating disorder called orthorexia nervosa. We talk a lot about eating disorders on this channel, and up to now my content's mainly focused on binge eating disorder because that's the one that I have the most direct experience with. But there are others out there, and I wanted to start to address some of them as well. I think the best known eating disorders are anorexia and bulimia. I think the most common one is binge eating disorder, but there are others as well, including orthorexia. In absolutely simple terms, orthorexia is defined as the obsession with eating or focusing on only consuming foods that you deem good for you, that you deem pure, that you deem healthy for you. In other words, it's kind of healthy eating taken to an extreme. The term was first published in the 1997 edition of Yoga Journal by a man named Dr. Steve Bratman. I couldn't find the original publication, but I did find a version reprinted online, so I've included that link in the description as well. And here are some of the key points to take away from that article. Orthorexia was referred to as a pathological fixation on eating so-called proper food. It often starts with wanting to either overcome illness or improve health. Due to the willpower and determination and grit in trying to stick to a certain diet or eat a certain way, it almost takes on a holy or spiritual feeling. And when you slip up or when you break away from that eating pattern, it almost feels like you sinned. That can mean you end up going into a cycle of trying to be stricter or be cleaner or be purer to kind of make up for that sin. And your thoughts tend to get dominated by the need to resist temptation and feelings of guilt or worry around food. It is important to note that not all healthy eating does become orthorexia and not all healthy eating habits are orthorexia. I think from my understanding, there is a line between where it's just doing something to improve your health or overcome illness, and when it gets taken to an extreme to the extent that it's causing substantial disruption to your day-to-day life. It's also worth noting that it's not one set type of diet or eating plan that causes it. For someone that follows a low-carb or ketogenic diet, they might see carbs as being foods that they have to avoid. For someone that follows a low-fat diet, it'll be the opposite, that they're trying to avoid fats because fats are deemed sinful. And at this point, I would like to add my normal disclaimer that I'm not a qualified medical professional, I'm not a dietitian, I'm not a doctor. If you have any specific questions, please do speak to a professional. In terms of symptoms and warning signs, I think it's important to note that there is a fine line between where someone is healthy eating and where it becomes an eating disorder like orthorexia. And a lot of the symptoms and behaviors kind of just sound like healthy eating. So like I said before, it really comes down to understanding that point where it goes from being a healthy eating thing to being where you are massively disrupting your day-to-day life. So I think it's important to think about the scale and extent of the behaviors that you're experiencing and the level of disruption they may cause. For example, not wanting to have a piece of cake because it doesn't fit into the current diet that you're following, that's probably healthy eating. Not wanting to have even a small, tiny piece of cake on your birthday and then worrying about it days beforehand and stressing about it for days afterwards, that's probably more disruptive, and that's much more likely to overlap with orthorexia than just healthy eating. There are some common symptoms of orthorexia, and I'm just going to list them off for you now. Cutting out entire food groups from your diet in order to make it more healthy, and over time that list of food groups that you cut out might increase. Judging other people's eating habits, whether you actually say anything to them or not. Obsession with following the diet that you deem healthy. Increased focus on what you're eating to the extent that it can interfere with your day-to-day life, like the cake example I just gave you. Feeling unable to put aside your own food rules or guidelines. Needing to know the exact calories or macronutrients in the food or drink that you're having. Guilt, anxiety, or stress over foods you're eating that you deem unclean or impure. Linking your emotional well-being to eating in a certain way. Feeling uncomfortable or insecure when you don't have full control over the food that you'll be eating. So say you go to a restaurant, for example, or you go to a friend's house. Rigid eating patterns, constantly checking food labels, and to an extent, social isolation, avoiding social situations where you don't have full control over the food that you're going to be served. It's important to note that a lot of the time it will just overlap with trying to eat a bit healthier or just be on a diet for a set period of time. So it is important to look at the scale of your feelings, the frequency, the intensity, and how much of an impact it's actually having on you. There is some testing available for orthorexia, and I will come on to that as well. And before I forget, if you are finding this content helpful, please remember to hit the subscribe button. In terms of causes of orthorexia, like with pretty much every other eating disorder and most mental health conditions, there isn't one set specific cause, but there are some common risk factors amongst eating disorders that can overlap here as well. Namely, past trauma, emotional stress, perfectionist or obsessive personalities or behavior patterns, stress, depression, or anxiety, or sometimes just feeling the need to have control over something. With that last one especially, I remember I went through a couple of phases of life where I felt like I didn't really have much control over a lot of things that were happening. I ended up exerting my control over food a lot more. And if I didn't have that control over my food, I kind of felt like I didn't have control over anything. We're going to come back to the example of the ketogenic diet. Say someone was heavier than they wanted to be and they wanted to lose some weight, and they had self-esteem issues and body confidence issues. And they tried other diets and nothing really seemed to work in terms of getting the weight to stay off. They then cut out carbs, follow the ketogenic diet, lose a lot of weight, get a lot of compliments for having lost weight, which is we seem to do when people lose weight. So they get a lot of positive reinforcement from having lost that weight. Suddenly, there becomes a strong link in their mind between not having carbs and losing weight and getting through the goals, and that positive praise and compliments that they got for having lost the weight. So in their mind, carbs might become demonized and become stigmatized, and they might take on a kind of almost sinful perception. This is quite a basic example, and it can be a lot more complex than that, but it's just a good way of sort of illustrating the point of how foods can be demonized based on the lives that we live. In terms of testing for orthorexia and the criteria, there is a 10-question test called the Bratman test. If you answer yes to 4 or 5 of these questions, that does suggest there is a strong possibility you have orthorexia and should seek professional. That doesn't mean sticking to listening to podcasts or reading blogs or watching YouTube videos. That means actually speaking to someone who's qualified to help with this. You can do the test for free online, and I've included a link to that in the description as well, in case you want to do it as your follow-up. So this video, here are the 10 questions. Do you spend more than 3 hours a day thinking about your diet? Do you plan your meals several days ahead? Is the nutritional value of what you eat more important than the emotional pleasure you get from it? Has the quality of your life decreased as the quality of your diet has increased? Have you become stricter with yourself lately? Does your self-esteem get a boost from eating healthily? Have you given up foods that you used to enjoy in order to eat the so-called right foods? Does your diet make it difficult for you to eat out, distancing yourself from friends and family? Do you feel guilty when you stray from your diet? Do you feel at peace and total control when you eat healthily? I answered yes to 6 or 7 of those questions, so I've also got some work to do here. In terms of getting a diagnosis, there are 2 parts to it. Part A is an obsessive focus on healthy eating, stress over unhealthy food choices, compulsively following food rules, sense of anxiety and shame from breaking those rules, and increasing strictness over time. And part B is using mental and physical health issues on a day-to-day basis in relationships or at work or in school. And body image and self-esteem start to become linked to your diet. So that's the questions for the test and the diagnostic criteria. And just to be clear, again, I'm not a qualified professional, so if you do have any concerns, if any of what I've just said sounds like something that you're going through, please do speak to a professional. Please do get professional help. Do not rely on social media or the internet to help with this kind of thing. In terms of how common is orthorexia, I couldn't find a lot of reliable stats, but here's what I did find. A 2004 study, which was conducted on a sample size of 404 people, found that orthorexia had a prevalence of 6.9%. A 2014 study estimated that amongst yoga practitioners, it can be as high as 86%. I guess that's a slightly different case because yoga focuses a lot on ideas of spirituality and cleanliness and purity. So it makes sense that your diet and the way you eat and the way you live kind of get tied to that as well. On the flip side, a 2017 study amongst college students that it's probably below 1%. A 2011 self-administered questionnaire in a US university estimated that it could be as high as 57.5%. So as you can see, we have absolutely zero consensus. I think one thing to bear in mind is that a lot of people that may have orthorexia, they also think they're just being really healthy with their diet. And that does make it harder to diagnose as an eating disorder. That makes it much harder to even recognize that it is an eating disorder, if it is. Looking back at my own sort of behavior patterns, I'm not going to say I definitely had orthorexia. I was never diagnosed with it, but I think a lot of my behavior patterns did overlap, and it kind of suggests I probably did. In terms of my experience, my food obsession got probably really bad after I lost my weight. I had made steady progress for quite a while, and then I plateaued. I kind of got more and more obsessive about what I was eating, and I was jumping on whatever sort of the newest fad or newest trend was. And that eventually led me to the paleo diet or the caveman diet. It's a very nutritious way to live, but it is also very restrictive. And then me being me, I wanted to follow it as strictly as possible. And that meant things like going out on special occasions became a very stressful experience. I kind of started to worry about it weeks ahead of time. And even now, it's nowhere near as bad, but I can still sometimes feel myself thinking, okay, what's the food going to be like? What do I have there? Is there going to be a healthy option? You know, those kinds of things. I wouldn't say I stress about it, but it does still cross my mind. And what I used to do was I used to basically starve myself all day just to kind of make space for the food that I would be having. And it wasn't about sort of calories or volume of food. It was more about that I felt like I was going to be putting in this sort of junk food or this poisonous thing. I wanted nothing else in my body so it could just focus on process, getting rid of this other thing that I was putting into it. Plus, I would usually do a sweaty cardio session to try and get that food out of my system a little bit quicker. In terms of on a normal day-to-day basis, all of my meals were planned out ahead of time. I was using MyFitnessPal religiously. In fact, my longest daily streak on MyFitnessPal is over 2,500 days. If I slipped up, then I kind of had an all or nothing mentality, so I would just kind of have whatever I wanted. I'd basically binge eat and just get back on track the next day. And I think that sort of behavior pattern ended up setting the foundation for binge eating disorder, which I started working through a bit later on. A few years later on, I became a lot more reclusive. I couldn't really enjoy going with friends or family, and it used to stress me out, and I used to have to know what the menu was like beforehand if we were going to go to a restaurant. I used to always check food labels. I still do sometimes, not quite as thoroughly or not quite as much, but it's something that hasn't left me just because I like to have some awareness of what I'm eating. But before, it used to be I wouldn't have something unless I knew exactly how many calories were in it and what the ingredients were. Most eating disorder content does tend to be focused more towards women or females. So I wanted to talk a bit about orthorexia in men specifically. Like I already said, there isn't really a huge amount of research or amount of data on how prevalent orthorexia actually is, at least not in terms of what I could find. But I did find a 2018 study, which I've also linked in the description, which suggests that healthy males are actually more likely to be at risk of developing orthorexia. The article mentioned that men are less likely to be dieting just for weight loss, and there's often a sports or performance goal related as well. So there's more likely to be a focus on calories and macronutrients and on the overall nutritional value of what someone's eating. I couldn't find any other stats to sort of back that up, but anecdotally at least, it does seem to make sense in my head. In terms of recovery and treatment, I just want to emphasize again, I'm not a qualified professional, so please do speak to a dietitian, a doctor, or a therapist. But from my understanding, there's no specific treatment for orthorexia. The kind of treatment or the kind of therapy you would go through is similar to other eating disorders. It might be cognitive behavioral therapy, it might be psychotherapy, which also includes some exposure to some of the foods that you tend to demonize or stigmatize. If there's an underlying cause or something that ended up leading to you developing orthorexia, it might be some work involved in addressing it too. Wrapping up, as I mentioned before, if you are affected by anything that I talked about, please do speak to a therapist, please do speak to a professional and get the help that you deserve or get the help that you need. You can try and work through it on your own. Just if you do, try and take it slower. And if you are on a diet, I'd say aim for a sort of 90% consistency. So that gives you 10% wiggle room where you're imperfect, where you have whatever you want. And it kind of puts a buffer between you becoming obsessive about the diet that you're following. And try to deliberately take control of food out of your life now and then. So make sure you go out to a restaurant or to someone's house every week or every couple of weeks. Don't look at the menu beforehand. Don't ask what you're going to be having. Just kind of let it happen. If you stop yourself from getting into the habit of having full control and make sure that you put yourself in situations where you don't have full control, it's going to make it much less likely that it's going to develop into this sort of more obsessive ongoing behavior pattern. So that's it on orthorexia. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please do let me know. And like I said before, if anything in this video has affected you, please do speak to a professional.